unfortunately.
Well, everyone, let me call this meeting to order. I'm Dana Hall, and I'm pleased to be the current president of the Owasco Watershed Lake Association, better known as OWLA. We're going to welcome in just a few minutes two representatives of the behavioral change consulting company called Evidn. But before I hand the microphone over to Tanea McIntosh and John Pickering, I just wanted to acknowledge the partnership with the Owasco Lake Watershed Management Council, chaired by Adam Effler. So both the Management Council and OWLA are presenting this meeting tonight. I also wanted to thank the Nature Conservancy, TNC, Jim Howe and Olivia Green, and John, as I'm sure you'll mention in your presentation, I believe Evidn is under contract to TNC, to the Nature Conservancy, to provide your services here in our Owasco watershed. And in fact, you've been doing that for a bit of time now, interrupted by COVID, I think. So if there is no other pressing business, we'll set aside all the normal kinds of discussion. And John and Tanea, welcome. Thank you so much for your time here on your Thursday morning. And over to you. We'll hold our questions, everyone, until the end, and make sure you have some hard ones, okay?
Thank you very much, Dana. And good evening, everybody. I might begin by saying this is such a beautiful time for a meeting. It's just gone 9 a.m. here. I know it's past 7 now in the Northeast, but it's a lot of our meetings are about 3 or 4 hours earlier than this, which takes us back to 5, 6 a.m. in the morning, and right at the end of the day, working day at least, for Eastern time. So thank you for having us along. Thank you, Dana and OWLA, for inviting us to be part of this discussion. I also wanted to mention Julie in particular. Julie, we were trying to piece this presentation together for the last 12 months, I think it's almost been, and we came oh so close on multiple occasions. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that as well in your role previously in leading OWLA. And I'm very glad we got here, and I hope it's now the first of potentially multiple appearances that we can make at the meeting. It's customary as well for us when we're in Australia to acknowledge actually the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, especially when we're talking about things like agriculture, water quality and other things. And here in Brisbane, where I am, that's the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And we just like to do that as an acknowledgement of the elders past and present and emerging. Aside, of course, from thanking Dana and Alla and Julie, and there's some wonderful friendly faces that I can see on the line here, and I won't go through everybody by name, but I can see you there either by name or by face, so it's great to see you all. I did want to mention the Nature Conservancy, who is funding this work that we're talking about, the Owasco project. I don't think I can see any of our colleagues from the Nature Conservancy online, but nevertheless, I did want to just punctuate that before we get too much further. And also some of the key project partners that are absolutely pivotal to this work, and in particular the Cougar Soil and Water Conservation District, which I believe Jason and Tyler could well be on the line from what I can see. I just wanted to acknowledge them up front, and of course provide any opportunity, Jason and Tyler, to interject as we go and add any other clarifying comments would be very welcome, but we will come back to that at the end as well. And of course, my colleague Tanea, who will do all the wonderful work that she does in managing the project for our Owasco. So anyway, there's some introductions. I do have a PowerPoint here. Let me see if I can relatively effortlessly share my screen, which I think I'll be able to do, and we'll get stuck in. All right, I'll just confirm with the group. Tanea, is that coming across okay for you? You can see it?
Looks great on my end, John.
That's great. Thank you, Tanea. So the project name is Owasco. As we mentioned, the Nature Conservancy is the funder of this particular body of work. For this evening's presentation, there are really three parts to it that we'll walk through. The first is a little bit about Evidn, but not just the company really, it's about behaviour science. And Dana mentioned about behaviour change and behaviour consultancy and so forth. A fair question is what does a group of psychologists and behavioural scientists have to do with harmful algal blooms and agriculture and water quality and soil health and these sorts of things in and around Owasco? Even more, what a bunch of Australians got to do with that. And I would clarify for the audience as well, Evidn LLC is an American company as well. We have an Australian company. I lead both, and we're just in the process of recruiting American and local staff and so forth. So they're actually two separate companies. So technically the project is run by an American company, Evidn LLC, just for the record. And so I'll provide an introduction then to the Owasco project itself, and actually wanted to lead with an invitation to this group to be part of the project in a more formal sense, and that is by virtue of participating in some of the program, which I'll explain towards the end. So that's our flight path for this evening. I've set up the PowerPoint to be somewhat self-explanatory insofar for those that may not be able to join this conversation or see the PDF of it at a later time. And Dana, I'm very happy for these images and slides to be shared accordingly. And it's certainly a principle of the project that we're very keen to communicate as openly and effectively as possible. And so I just make that point as well. But here are three propositions that I really wanted to put to the group about why behavioural science. And they're pretty straightforward. And the first is that we believe, and the evidence certainly indicates, that many of the world's biggest challenges are actually, and are caused by, in many instances, the attitude actions of people. And therefore, if you think about that, in particular when it comes to environmental, and we're not just talking about any one environmental issue here, there's many that we could potentially look at, from climate change through to different things such as water quality. But therefore, understanding and modifying behaviour is going to be crucial to actually forming solutions to these challenges. And in some ways, from a behavioural scientist point of view, and I'm not trying to be flippant with this in any way, shape or form, but we're not really dealing with environmental problems. We're not really dealing with water quality problems. We are dealing with issues that emerge in the realm of human behaviour. We're dealing with behavioural problems. And now that might seem like an overly simplistic idea, but I really want to impress that concept upon the group this evening. And therefore, behavioural science is really potentially useful, because it is a discipline that is set up to understanding the motivations that we all have for our thinking, the way we make decisions, and perhaps most importantly, how do we go about helping promote change, behavioural change, attitudinal change, you might call it. So that's kind of the why behind what role does behavioural science have in a situation such as Owasco and the watershed. By means of an example, and some of you would have heard of this in another setting, but I did just want to repeat it briefly because there are some new faces here on the call. But Evidn, of course, is therefore about an evidence-based approach to behavioural change. And we cut our teeth, so to speak, and learned a lot about how to do that. And I won't go back through the full backstory of our organisation. It's possibly useful for this group to know that it's effectively a spin-out company from the University of Queensland here, where we spent a decade developing different behaviour change programs for different sectors and settings, and then had an opportunity around 2015 to start work looking at the Great Barrier Reef, which of course is one of the world's great natural icons, and certainly one of Australia's prides and joy, you might call it. And here in Queensland, it's what we like to say, it's ours, to the extent that it's under our custodianship. It's in the state of Queensland in our waters. And very regretfully, the reef is under enormous threat, and big parts of it are dying or have died. And the two biggest threats to the reef are climate change and the warming of the waters and ocean acidification, which of course is a global problem and requires an equally global solution. And the second is water quality. And within the water quality domain, the evidence accumulated over many years points fairly directly to the agricultural community. In particular, and as pictured on the right, the sugarcane farms of Queensland. And pictured in that particular photo, I always like to make this point, are actually two of the greatest farmers that I know. And as far as environmental management goes, they would be up there on any international standard with their practices. So I never like to insinuate that we've put a couple of guilty farmers on the screen here. Quite the contrary, they're very much leading the way. But what it does mean is that there's been a lot of pressure on the agricultural community to change and adopt nutrient management planning in particular, because it's the water quality and the nitrogen in the water that runs out to the reef and then generates a number of particular issues. And it's a very complicated scientific set of questions that support that as well. And I'm not trying to say controversial, but as this group in particular fully well understands, the issue of water quality can be very complicated in terms of the different source point of the various pollutants, the level of which is moderated or mediated by precipitation events. You know, there's all sorts of different weather variables that need to be considered here. It is a complicated scene. Nevertheless, a huge investment over many years has led to a massive number of initiatives to try and work with farmers, or perhaps perhaps coerce farmers to change and adopt new practices. And over many years, the rate of change was nowhere near what people were wanting it to be. It was very slow, if you will. And ultimately, our group, Evidn, was brought in to address one simple question. Why won't these farmers change? Why won't these cane farmers change? We don't understand it. We've got this natural icon right off the coast. The evidence is clear. This is the narrative that was said to us, I might add. And we've got all of these incentives. We've got regulations that have been brought in and different policies. We've got fines for over application of fertiliser. We've got nutrient management plans. We've got millions of dollars of investment in extension and agronomy services. And the rate of adoption of the best management practice program after many years was really just trickling along. And so Evidn came in and did an analysis of the why. And I'm not going to go through that with us because that'll take up the rest of the time. But this is probably the trigger point that led to the OWLA project. And what you're seeing here, the data on this graph, which was current up to about March this year, we're just waiting on the next tranche. But this is the actual number of accredited farms in Queensland of the BMP program, the Best Management Practice program. And remember, we started this work in 2015. And as you can see there, the rate of accreditation, and there's 4 different geographic regions of the Queensland sugarcane industry. It would be obvious again to this group, but I'll just highlight the sheer scale of this area. Queensland it's around about 2,500 miles long. As you know, Australia's a very big country, like the US, and the state of Queensland takes up about 3/4, or just over half, actually, about 2/3 of the length of the country there. So these farms, some of them are absolutely gigantic, and more like perhaps you might see in the Midwest, perhaps in a US setting. So that's just a bit of context here for the group. At any rate, in the cane changer region where we operated, with everything else being held constant in other regions, you can see that rate of adoption through to accreditation of the program skyrocketed, frankly. It's somewhere in the vicinity now of up over 600% compared to other regions where all other things were basically the same except for the behavioural science component. And again, could be lots of questions about this, and there probably ought to be. I will move on, but that was this project, and I'm not trying to in any way, shape or form appear to be like we're tooting our own horn, but it garnered some international attention because of the nature of the reef and what it had done in a number of different outlets, and certainly led to the Nature Conservancy in the US saying we would like to include behaviour science as part of our approach. And that's how OWLA effectively started. I won't speak for the Nature Conservancy, but for a range of reasons, they thought that it would be good to start in the state of New York. And given their existing work in the Finger Lakes and their commitment to the area, they thought it would be really, really opportune to start on a small demonstration project in Owasco. So from Queensland, the Reef to Owasco. What I'll do, I just wanted to share with you 3 behavioural science principles from the Cane Changer project, which in itself is a culmination of lots of other projects and work and knowledge and so on and so forth. But I think they're really important because they underpin our work in Owasco. The first is that change is not about an individual, it's about the system that individuals live in. And therefore, when we ever consider the question as a behavioural scientist of change, the first thing is that change is for everyone. And hence the point, if you will, about how we approaching Owasco in particular, about this inclusive approach to change and not singling out any one group, because therein lies a problem if we do. And it was Bronfenbrenner back in the 70s. And this diagram that I've got on the screen right now, this is like artwork for behavioural scientists. You know, I'm the sort of person that has this printed out on my wall at home and kind of look at it, you know, as I'm going to bed and admire it. But what it's, that's a joke, by the way, but we can be very dry, the Australians. I'm not sure if that carries across. I'm still calibrating my humour, but it's really interesting, nevertheless. And Bronfenbrenner said, look, and it was initially designed to understand child development and the behaviour of people, just generally speaking. And the question was, well, how do you understand what makes for a person to grow up well, adjusted and healthy and happy and all that kind of thing? And the really obvious answer on one level is that, well, it's not just about the child or the baby or the infant, it's about their individual characteristics, which you can see in the middle there, their gender and their age and their own health and genetic code and various other things. Then their family and school and religion and their peers and the health system around them. And then it goes right out to the ideologies, the culture of a place, to the social services available, social systems like neighbourhoods and the role of mass media, political influence, and so on and so forth. And therefore, that's, I hope, pretty intuitive to everybody on this call. But if you're serious about modifying behaviour, you have to at least understand the system in which behaviour is unfolding in and have multiple intervention points, not just one. And that gets then kind of tricky because some of these things you can't intervene with, but you need to find the ones that you can. And look, by means of an example, what you're seeing here are some photos of as you'll notice, a lot of women around a table, and they're actually wives of a lot of the farmers here in Australia. And up the front, you're seeing an instructor in both instances, and you can kind of make it out on the photo on the right about record keeping template on the PowerPoint screen up the front there. And quite literally, and there's Tanea, I think you can kind of see her there on the photo on the right, running this project. And Tanea did a brilliant job in managing the Cane Changer project, and therefore we thought appropriate to lead the work in Owasco. But the wives of farmers were instrumental in running the family business and also with literacy, numeracy, and were more inclined to want to keep written records of fertiliser application. And they ended up being a very important contributor to the whole program. And they were involved heavily in our training. So just to give you some idea of, rather than just thinking about the farmer, so why won't the farmers change? Well, one of the reasons might have been that they didn't want to keep the records, or they couldn't, or whatever it might be, but the wives were able to. So by taking the Bronfenbrenner approach, by zooming out a little, it provided another angle, if you will, and involving a really, really important group of people, that is the ladies and the wives of farmers, for a range of different reasons. So there's an example. Point number 2, this is always fascinating. All of us, and I myself am as guilty of this as anybody, think that we're doing the right thing pretty much in most situations. Or if we're not so much doing the right thing, we've got a really good reason for doing it the way we do it anyway, even if the objective data may indicate that there's a better way of doing it. It's a really, really important point when it comes to understanding the human psyche. It is something that plays out in all of our lives all the time. And I like to reference at this junction a wonderful American in the form of Daniel Kahneman. And some of you may have come across his work. He's pictured here getting his Nobel Prize. He's a psychologist, but he got his Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. And in 2013, he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Obama, which, as you all understand, is the highest civilian honor you can receive in the United States. So he's fairly decorated, to say the least, and he spent his life studying psychology and decision-making. And he concludes as follows: "Our comforting conviction that the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance." And what's really fascinating is that Kahneman maintains that, and the evidence is pretty clear in support of it. And it doesn't even matter about how educated you are, or how much you know about behavioural science, or how many times you give a presentation such as this and refer to this quote. We're still, all of us, at times, prone to not necessarily being fully aware of why we're doing what we're doing and thinking what we think. So this is an important principle, because when it comes to affronting people where it appears the evidence is really clear that there's a problem, and why aren't you doing something, or why don't you listen, or why don't you believe in climate change, or you can insert whatever you want here, you can see that there's a psychological mechanism playing out where people are unlikely to agree with whatever it is you're saying anyway. And so people need to be given an opportunity for their inner I was going to say identity, but that's moving us in a slightly different direction. But for them to not have egg on their face, for want of a better expression, because they probably don't deserve it, or they don't need to anyway. And again, I won't go into the depths of this, but the whole point of what we did with the Game Changer project is provide the farming community with a chance to set the record straight. And by participating in the Best Management Practice program, it wasn't about admitting guilt and that they were wayward or bad farmers, because they weren't. And that's the thing. And we believe that about OWSCO as well. It's about the fact that there's a range of different factors that contribute to why people may or may not be inclined to enroll in a program. And they, at the end of the day, want to do the right thing. And so they need to be given the opportunity to prove that, which is the idea of setting the record straight. And it was a bit of a play on words, because record keeping for fertilisers was the key thing we needed to do. The final one, and then I'll touch on OWSCO, and then Dana will open it up for some questions, because I want to leave a good 20 minutes at least for that process. But when it comes to change, we really need to understand that barriers matter more than benefits, especially at the group level. And the reason I mention that is that often when we try to think about getting someone to change their mind or their thinking or their behaviour, we dial up the benefits of the proposed change. So this is cheaper, it's faster, it will save you money, it's good for the environment. You know, I'll insert whatever you want there, the benefits. The reality is that when it comes to change and why it doesn't happen, it's more likely to be a result of the presence of a barrier, or indeed multiple barriers. And it was Kurt Lewin who articulated this, again, another famous American, Cornell University social psychologist back in the 40s and 50s, in fact. And it's lovely to have a partnership with Cornell as part of this project, and in fact, be very close to the lab where Lewin worked. But he basically said that at any given moment, the behaviour of somebody is a combination of driving and restraining forces that act in an equilibrium. And your decision to want to or not do something is always a function of those forces colliding. And what Lewin showed through a lot of empirical data and testing was that rather than dial up the driving forces, we should seek to remove or mitigate those restraining forces to get behavioural change. And again, I won't go through the depths of all that. I'm going to mention a couple about OWSCO that are really important. But what I do want to say is that the only way to get at that is to really understand people. And to do that properly means investing time and effort and energy and all sorts of different things. And pictured here are some photos from a few years ago of me in cane paddocks of Australia with farmers, quite clearly. And I always like to tell the story. On the right there is a farmer called Peter Jackson. He's not wearing shoes. That's not a mistake. We haven't just gone for, he's got them wet or something, but a lot of farmers in that area don't wear shoes. It's just a thing. And what's really interesting, and I'm not trying to play up to stereotypes here, but that particular farm block is in the north of Queensland, and Queensland, Australia, is home to many of the world's most venomous snakes. And Tully, where that photo is taken, is in itself the snake hotspot of the north, including to taipans, which are one of the most venomous snakes in the world. And yet that doesn't stop the farmers from not wearing shoes in this instance. So and I just find that it's a bit of trivia, for want of a better phrase. So that's a little bit about Australia there as well. Beautiful spot, by the way. I'll put my tourism hat on. Not a good time for that though, but once COVID clears, beautiful part of the world. Nevertheless, it requires a deep dive into understanding the perspective of the farmer. And once you do, it's amazing what insights we can glean. Which brings me to OWSCO and I guess the penultimate point. It is a behaviour change program modelled on the Cane Changer project that I've just described. It's probably worth mentioning to the group that Evidn doesn't just work in agriculture. We work in transport. We work in the health sector. We work at the moment, I'm going from here to a meeting at a finance company who's trying to change the behaviour of people with respect to financial literacy. So these tools and techniques are not just about farmers or agriculture or environment. They're actually applicable in many domains. I wanted to make a mention of our partners that are directly involved in this project, and I have already a couple of them, including the Coogee County District and Jason and Tyler on the line. Tompkins is involved, Ag and Markets, Cornell, the American Farmland Trust, and of course we'd like to think that the Management Council and Adam, I saw you on the line there, and your team have been so helpful in hosting us and including us and being positive. We really wanted to make that point. And of course the watershed inspection team and Drew and so forth, and OWLA, this group, I think all need to be considered partners of the project because we're all in it together. And hopefully that's not too much of a COVID term, but that's how we're always thinking about it. The goals of the project, really are to firstly and foremostly accurately portray and communicate the story of the OWSCO farmer. And it's so important. And there's a lot of reason for that. And I can go into many of them, but that's really the primary goal, as well as building the farmer's confidence and capacity to engage in practice change, environmental programs and data sharing and other things like that. We're also very interested in the capacity of the landholders, but also the professionals that work with those landholders, other stakeholders, including people on this call, in helping boost that capacity to lead and drive change. And in particular, point 4, how we can continue to increase trust and cooperation between and among groups in the watershed, something we all understand to be very important. And of course, designing a system for increasing the adoption of those BMPs that actually goes broader, that it doesn't just stop at OWSCO. Ideally, there's principles that we'd like to think are shareable across the entire region, which is obviously something quite important. And look, an overarching point I always want to make with the work that we do, we're very time limited, temporary inclusions in this part of the world or part of the project. Doesn't matter where in the world we're talking, by the way. And what I mean by that is that there's already an enormous and wonderful body of work happening. There's 9 plans. There's the districts and all the work that Jason and the team are doing. There's all of these things. The farmers are daily, striving towards better and productivity and profitability and so forth. We're not there to make all that happen per se. We're there to simply tweak a few things and add some of those behavioural bits, remove a few barriers, and try and boost some of the capacity to just amplify what's already happening, including the thinking of all the different groups in the watershed. So I'd just like to make that point. We don't see ourselves as coming in and creating all this stuff and getting change to happen, but rather just amplifying what's already occurred, if you can. For a timeline sense, the first stage of the project was completed late last year, which was the behavioural analysis. And I'll just give you some key findings from that. That finished up late last year, and we started our implementation essentially the last few months, and forming our project committee team, and that will run to mid to late next year. I'll explain what we're trying to do. It is interrupted by COVID, there's no doubt about that, but not in a particularly negative way, and I say that respectfully to everybody in the virus, and of course acknowledging its significant threat to the world and hardship it's caused. From the project's point of view, agriculture still continues, the world keeps on spinning in that regard, and we've been able to move a lot of the engagements to virtual, which has allowed us to continue, and we will continue and have the full support of the Conservancy to do so. As far as some of the big, I mentioned about those driving and restraining forces, the Lewin stuff, the green and red arrows, We did a big analysis to that effect with the Owasco watershed there last year and revealed a number of driving and restraining forces that are really important that inform the design of all of our strategies. The top three, in terms of driving forces, we needed a framework to help drive change, and the Agricultural Environmental Management Framework, the AEM framework, of which the soil and water districts are the custodians of, is a really wonderful thing and a beautiful platform to help tell the grower's story, engage different farmers in the practice change and improvement processes and capture that. And Tyler and Jason, particularly from Cougar, have done a wonderful job in bringing that together. And we're already doing that as part of their work, and we were just lucky that we could incorporate it as part of the Owasco project. And perhaps at the end, Jason and Tyler, if you wanted to make any comments about that process and the baseline data and how you're capturing it, feel free to. If it's not the right time, not a problem. Obviously, ag and markets and the soil and water conservation districts themselves, in terms of driving change and engagement with the farming community, is absolutely key. And there's just such a wonderful combination of stakeholders in and around Owasco. I've been nothing but just so overwhelmed by the groups such as OWLA, the Management Council, whether it's the different agricultural advisors, for example, the scientists from Cornell. It's really fantastic. The quality of the people and the intent to do the right thing really makes it a great place for a project like this to work. The restraining forces, which you'll recall will be the key focus of our work because it's all about how we get change in many ways. There was a little bit of a lack of united approach to what the actual issue is and who needs to do what and by how much and whose responsibility it is and how do we get more activation of change, especially in the agricultural community. That was one of the things that we did identify. Be very interested to get this group's perspective on that, noting that in various ways we have indirectly through our discussions previously in other forum. A bit about loss aversion here, and that at the time, it can be best understood as what people perceive that they will lose by having to do some kind of change to whatever it is they're currently doing. Look, that can play out in a lot of different ways, and it can even right down to control is one of them that can come up from time to time. Loss of control over one's own story, over one's own beliefs, over one's own sense of rightness or wrongness by virtue of having to change. We tend to think that we lose something, and that's something that we're really attuned to with our Owasco. And finally, at least for the top three, the lack of positive reinforcement. So what we observed was a fair bit of pressure for particularly on the farmers to change and do things differently, but not necessarily the equal level of celebration, shall we call it. Wrong phrase, to be fair.
I hear this stuff. Sure, I finally got it.
Oh.
Is that a question? Oh, that might be someone not on mute. I don't know if that's a question, but I'll save it for the end anyway, if that was a question. But a lack of positive reinforcement for the farming community in particular. So where we are at the moment, we've established a project committee where we're enrolling 20 farmers across the watershed of different farm types, sizes, geographic sublocations. We're working with the districts to do this. And basically enrolling them in the program, for want of a better term, and using them as exemplars of how we flow through the AEM framework. There's alignment here to things that are happening with the 9E plan, and then look at all of the mechanisms of whether it's the training, the capacity building, the way we engage farmers, the reason why become involved in this program and get on board. And then be able to scale that across the watershed more broadly under a separate stage, which would be a stage 3. And then combined with that, we have that training and capacity building. That's for farmers, that's for extension and technical experts and advisors and districts and so forth. And also the civic and community groups, such as this one, which is really what I wanted to put to you. And we'll accompany that with a mass media and mixed media communication strategy. And again, I'd make the very clear point as I do this, it's going to complement and leverage whatever is already going on. and I've already had discussions with Adam and the Management Council about the Be Watershed Aware campaign, for example, how we can feed into that. Conversations with Steve, for example, there yesterday morning on the radio, Finger Lakes FM, looking at how we get a regular radio spot talking about the project, for example, other things like that that'll come online. So that to finalise, Dana, and then we'll have this discussion that we keep promising and these hard questions, which I'm trying to put off, the behavioural science-based training, and this is what we'd really like to involve OWLA with, and not just OWLA, other groups as well. As we said, there's different segments, if you will, of the local population, but essentially taking a deeper dive into some of the things we just talked about. How do we understand the psychology of change? How do we look at mechanisms for communicating differently to enhance trust and cooperation and communication between groups? How do we get a more cohesive local area and help ensure everybody's on the same page? And again, I emphasize, this is simply illuminating, I think, the light which is already on in and around Owasco, and how and to what extent we behavioural scientists can just simply contribute to what you're already endeavouring to do. So please don't take this as a suggestion that everything's out of control and needs to be corrected, but rather we feel as behavioural scientists that there is a value that we can add over and above what's already there. So I think I'm going to bring it to an end there and say thank you. My details on Tanea's are there on the screen, and I'd invite now questions and comments, Dana, and of course we've got Jason and Tyler here as well from the Cuyahoga County District. If they wanted to make any comments, that would be a great time to do it as well.
Dana, if I may, I believe Olivia is here from Nature Conservancy.
Oh, great.
And Adams sent a message in way back at the beginning in the chat window. I can lead off with that if we want, or
Olivia, you're muted right now and we can't see you, but perhaps you're on the phone. Would you like to make some comments supporting rationale and so forth in response to John's presentation, which I found outstanding, John? Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I don't have much to add. Just wanted to thank you all to OWLA for giving John and Tanea the chance to present this work to your group tonight.
And thanks to you and your organization, Olivia, for sponsoring Evidn and making the substantial progress that has already been achieved.
Yeah, we're really excited about the work.
Jason or Tyler, do you have any questions or comments to add in? Are farmers, for example, are farmers resistant to change? I come from a farming family, and I thought we're highly motivated to try to improve our profitability and to be honest, to stay in business. Jason or Tyler, any comment about that?
No, I would say, with the farming community in general, it doesn't really have to be in the Owasco Lake area, but throughout the United States, if you don't change, you're not going to be around for a while. So, it's almost like having a cell phone. They change almost daily. Well, farms do as well, regardless if it's with planting or harvesting or anything else in between. A lot of the farms, at least in the Owasco Lake watershed, have changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years alone, with soil health practices, reduced tillage management, cover crops, feeding and harvesting nutrients for their animals or crops, or feeding the world. So far so good. The only thing right now is we got to get John and Tanea back out in the field and actually, show them what farming looks like here in the States.
Thank you, Jason. How best to give people an opportunity to ask questions? I mean, John, if it were up to me, I'd go through many of your charts and ask for more insight, background, rationale. Dave, any suggestions as to how we ought to organize our question and answer period here?
If they want to, if people want to, they can type in the chat box, but I'm not sure everybody's comfortable with that. I've got 2 questions in the chat box already. I can lead off with those and people can think a bit.
Let's do that very thing, please.
I'll read them. The first one came from Adam way back at the beginning of the presentation, or towards the beginning. He says, why does the rate of BMP adoption for wet tropics exceed that of others?
Yeah, thanks. Great question, Adam. And I had my screen in presentation mode, so I didn't see the question pop up. Otherwise, I would have paused, so forgive me for that. So back in the graph that we saw there in the wet tropics had the big acceleration. The first and most important thing was that the BMP program, so it was actually a program that the whole industry created. It had 17 different main farming practices that are included within it. And it was available in all 4 regions is the first thing. And it had facilitation and financial support, and all the things in all the 4 regions were the same. The single biggest thing that was different, and here's what's also really interesting, Adam, there was legislation in the wet tropics about nutrient management and the amount of fertilizer that could have been put on that was introduced years ago and didn't alter the adoption of the program, which was to make people accordant with that. And there's a number of reasons for that. And that's not for me just to simply therefore say legislation equals, like, it's not going to work. But it's I know, Adam, we've had this discussion previously, it's a complicated scene, particularly in agriculture. The Cane Changer project rolled out all of its strategies in the wet tropics alone. And that included many of the things we're talking about here in Owasco, working with the farmers, building that capacity, getting the right communication out there, providing the right reasons psychologically to become involved, making sure we had the right way of measuring it and getting people engaged in a systematic way. The equivalent of that in Owasco would be the Agricultural Environmental Management Framework, that the advice and the leadership of the program was from the source that was most trusted to farmers, which was the equivalent in Australia of, say, Cayuga County Soil and Water Conservation District, for Cayuga rather, Soil and Water Conservation District. So there was a range of factors, Adam, but it was the behavioural science approach was one of the distinct elements.
Okay. Adam, you good with that?
I'm good. Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
And John, what I think you said was that the rollout of advocacy for improved practices started and was fully implemented in the wet tropics first, before the other 3. Did I understand right?
You understood right, Dana, and it still hasn't yet been implemented in the other 3. So that's it's a quasi-experimental type approach in that regard, but we were able to see by just contrast and comparison what was happening in the active behavioural science area compared to those where there wasn't the behavioural science approach. And we've now got almost 4 years of data on that, which is really interesting. So, yeah.
Right. Another question from Kim Mills. Kim's one of our board members. Could you elaborate on the toolkit of skills for developing change?
Definitely. Thanks, Kim. Good to see and hear from you again. Great to see you there. This would be a really opportune time to introduce Tanea to the conversation, because she leads this work in terms of the training and the toolkit. Tanea, did you just want to spotlight a couple of the key things that we look at in that regard?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the question, Kim. And again, thanks everyone for having us here. So really, the toolkit of change, and there's a couple of different variations of this, so it depends on the group that we're working with, but it's really designed to provide participants with an opportunity to enhance their work within the community. So often, this could include really practical skills, so things like time management, habit formation, coalition building, communication skills. But one of the things that we do is we really do make sure that we are tailoring all of our content. So before we run, say, training with OWLA, we'll actually call all of the participants that are going to be coming along, and we'll have really brief interview questions with them to make sure that the topics that we're covering and the skills that we're providing are really quite tailored to the particular program that we'll be teaching on the day. So there's quite a diverse range of that, but often it is very much around how we can enhance trust, communication, cooperation, and build some of those relationships between groups. So yeah, if you have any other questions, do let me know, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Question from Julie. Do you have specific recommendations for how OWLA can make positive, quote unquote, upstream, downstream connections with farmers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Julie. And in many ways, the presence of the question itself is almost part of the answer. And what I mean by that is the openness to the thought. Again, something that I would see inherent in this group, that there is a need for a better connection is what I'm trying to say. And hence people being present at forum like this and being open to the idea, and hence again why I say all the ingredients are there, the fundamentals, I think, in how we can do this. There's a couple more specific things though. The first is, and this would be, and I would say a plug for our training, but of course the capacity building and training that we're suggesting is included by, it's supported by the Nature Conservancy. We're not trying to sell the group anything in that regard. But we'd look at some of those inherent biases and cognitive heuristics, we'd call it, that lead us to think a certain way about a certain group of people in the first instance in terms of its attribution to a certain problem and the attributions and characteristics of that group. There might be some folks out there who, for example, might default to thinking that farmers are reluctant to change. And that's why deliberately I put that question up there, the cane farmer example. The question that at the time that we were asked to solve is, why won't these farmers change? Very direct question. And it's an accusation. It's not just an open-ended question. So we need to do a bit of work to understand our own psychology towards what we perceive as the problem. But then more directly, and this is something that we're exploring with Jason and Tyler and various other partners, how do we connect people? Is there a way of further involving or integrating what's happening on farm with groups like OWLA, of providing, you know, there's often farm days and there's field days and there's farm tours and there's farm open days and various things like that. But is there actually a way of we can bring people together physically through this process? I say physically, perhaps the wrong word in COVID, at least virtually, to be able to design different programs together more effectively. Now, again, I'm conscious as I say that of groups like Adam and the Management Council and have representatives of, and even on this, we've got Ken, I think was here, I saw, and other farmers online, you know, so it's a myth to think that kind of thing isn't already happening. I'm really conscious of bringing, you know, representatives from different groups together. But Julie, I think we can do a bit more, and particularly from the behavioural science point of view. And so the most direct answer to your question is we'd love to see everybody on this discussion, part of our first wave of the capacity building workshop that we'd love to give. And I think that would be a great thing to be part of. But I'm very biased and probably ignorant too, based on what Kahneman says, but you know, at least I acknowledge it.
Tanea, that behavioral, that workshop, does that need to wait until you can again join us here, or can it be done virtually?
No, it most certainly can be done virtually, Dana, and that's something we'd very much like to explore with this group here. So absolutely, the answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And just on that, the logistics, Dana, we'll get, we didn't come prepared tonight with all of that information in terms of, because we're still building it and want the consent of this group to at least flag it as an idea worth exploring. But we do multiple, and we do them in relatively small group settings. So as such that we can engage fully, whether it was virtually or in person, we'd have the same format. So, you know, we're talking up to half a dozen people at a time, rather than say, I think we've got 30 or so on the call here. We do it in smaller groups, so we can probably.
I was thinking back to the picture that you showed, the photos you showed of the cane farmer wives, There appeared to be 25 or so women in the meeting.
Yeah, I think Tanea, whether 25, there was certainly more than 6, at least in one of them. I think about a dozen in that particular one. With that, Dana, the record keeping workshops, which were exemplified in those photos, so a little bit more transactional, to the extent that it was literally how to navigate the under the BMP program. They've got literally the pro forma, the form that needs to be filled out, and the way to do that. So it was very much an instructional training course on how to fill out a form. Not trying to oversimplify it, but that was fundamentally what it was. It wasn't about the behavioural sort of skills and various other things. So it had a slightly larger format, just to clarify why in that instance.
Thank you, John.
Dana, we have no more questions through the chat box. I think anybody else could ask a question as long as we don't get too rowdy here. The best thing to do is just speak right up, I guess.
Rick Nelson has a question.
Hi, Rick.
John, on the first restraining force that applied towards the Owasco Lake, you mentioned there was lack of united approach. And can you elaborate on that when it was opposite to the AEM? Was there not a united approach in following AEM procedures, or what's happening there? What is that lack of united approach locally?
Yeah, thanks, Rick, and a good pick up there. So the lack of united approach as a restraining force is a different issue altogether to the AEM framework. So it's not connected to the AEM. It's not a criticism, if you will, of the AEM framework. Rather, the lack of united approach was with the very specific purpose in mind. And I might again just clarify this. Our aim, we were brought in to work with under the banner of TNC, but of course with Jason and the team, to further extend the number of farmers that we have engaged in various practices for practice change and adoption, and how we can do that. So it's a very pointed issue about, in that regard, farmers and how we go about the idea of the whole community rallying behind that community positively to go about getting adoption and change. And in that regard, that's what we noted. There was a little bit of at times, lack of unity about the best way of doing that. Is it a legislative thing? Is it a communications thing? Is it just an awareness building thing? Who leads it? Who should drive it? And again, I'm very conscious. We've got Adam here, the management council set up, particularly, of course, with respect to water quality in the lake itself and the various inputs that go to that to help provide that united, all-in together approach to it. Dare I say, Adam's got a broader remit than what we do. We're at the very pointed end of the farmer and her or he and their practices. So that was where we saw the lack of unity. Rick? Yeah.
Thank you. I had one follow-up. You mentioned, I don't know if I heard it, but they're going for 20 farmers to participate in this program. Have they been selected, or is that in the works?
That's in the works, Rick. That is, as we speak, that's our hot topic at the moment. And the reason there's, I won't say a delay in this, but we're not in a rush. There's some very practical reasons, and this is a great example of why it's so important who leads this work. So we're obviously taking advice from Jason and Tyler about timing. So how's the season tracking, what's harvesting, what's planting, what time do farmers have? So there's a major consideration that we've got there. So we've got an attentive audience, but also that we're trying to do this in a systematic way that it can be multiplied and extended. So it wouldn't be that hard for us to press the button and round up 20 farmers. I say that respectfully, but we put all hands on deck. But then where are the next 20 and the 20 after that and the 180 after that? We need a systematized way of doing this, which involves a welcome pack and a procedure and a way of engaging and the right communication materials. This is a much bigger answer than the question you asked, Rick, but we're putting a lot of system behind it, which takes a bit of time to develop. So yes, that's happening now and will be happening throughout September, just to clarify. We'll have those selected.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Daniel.
And I hope I don't offend any of my neighbors. we have lakefront property halfway down the lake on the west side. We are exposed to a large cattle farm, and I know there are a large number of what do we call them, high concentration animal farms. Dutch Hollow, there's another one on the east side of the lake. This is one type of farm. Another thing that strikes me is Mennonite farmers. There are a whole bunch of Mennonite families, and there is a Mennonite church. I'm a retired minister, so this kind of is something that calls my attention. I'm wondering if there is a way to approach the Mennonite church, the Mennonite community, and get a number of those farmers on board, or are they already? I don't know these things, but I'm just curious. We have a number of different types of farms, and how are we accounting for those as we approach them with management practices?
Thank you, Daniel, and an excellent and very important question. And indeed, I'd make mention of, you might recall the Bronfenbrenner diagram, my bit of artwork, and the role of the church was one of those key considerations, and that is less and more significant in some areas rather than others for various reasons. And you've just identified that in and around Owasco, and in fact the Finger Lakes more broadly, of course, the Mennonite farming community is quite prevalent. And at this point, we've identified that, and of course there's a certain approach to farming that would be at least partially, if not quite significantly, influenced by religion in that regard. So it's easy for me to simply say it's outside of the scope of our project to look at that. What I really mean is the Mennonite community is not excluded in any way, shape or form from our Owasco, but it's understood that there's likely to be a minimal involvement of the Mennonite community because it does require a more tailored approach to the way communication happens, information flows, ideas are shared and spread through that community, and being very respectful of the customs and various other things that go with membership to that religious group, as it were. So we're not looking at that directly. We do not have a strategy for the Mennonite community as yet, I would say, but it's certainly been flagged in our analysis that, of course, it's a reasonable number of people in the first instance and would need its own approach. And that might be something that we explore as this project expands under a next phase, for example.
I would be interested in doing more work personally. Unfortunately, I'm also a seasonal resident there and would only be available during the summers. But I'm very curious, and I might even have some ways of becoming involved in that. I don't know. I don't know what I'm getting into.
Thank you, Dan.
John, I have a question. This is Ken Kudla. I met you at the Springside dinner. When I looked at this, the wet tropics adoption, I'm just wondering about the success measures here. The behavioral change piece, it looks like it's kind of more participation measures. But then will there be any hard results measures that say, which participation measures had the largest impact on what we're all, driving towards, and that's water quality? Will there be, will your program include not only participation measures, but also the behavioral change side, but then the ultimate, I guess, outcome measures?
Yeah. This is a great question, Ken, and it's certainly been a big focus of our work as a project committee in Owasco for the past couple of months, looking at impact measures and metrics and various ways of doing what you just described, as in looking beyond participation. I'll circle back to that, but what I would say is that what was really important in the example you mentioned in Australia, the wet tropics, the BMP program, the reason that participation was so important was for this reason, that a farmer has to enroll in that program, they then, by virtue of doing that, there's those 17 farming practices they have to provide evidence that they're doing. And there's written evidence, might be the purchase of equipment or an implement or a subsurface fertilizer applicator, whatever it might be, the rollout of a cover crop, for example. And then that's independently audited at the 12-month mark by a group that's paid to do just that, and they get their accreditation, that they're BMP accredited. So we've got confidence that they're not just haven't signed up for something and participated, but they're actually actively doing a practice that is linked to water quality. And those 17 farming practices are the ones the scientists have determined are likely to improve water quality. What then happens, and this is an additional issue which isn't quite as prominent in the Owasco Finger Lakes area as it is in the reef, but all of those practices, once the farmer enrolls, are then uploaded to a central system. Part of the reason for this is the Great Barrier Reef is obviously such a significant ecosystem, but also it's a World Heritage Site for starters. So it actually has the United Nations. So it's got all the local levels going on, but we're audited by the UN quite literally on a 3-yearly basis about progress towards targets, given the sheer size of the thing and its global significance. And therefore, all those practices are uploaded into a system and then modeled to show the water quality improvements at different catchments along the reef. And then a report card's issued, which captures all of that. So it's in other words, those participation data do link directly to water quality. In Owasco, yeah.
Sorry, John. So that model will be carried over into the work that you're going to be doing here in the Finger Lakes region and Owasco Lake primarily.
It'll be adapted is the best way I'd say. Different infrastructure, different systems, working with what's already there. The AEM framework provides a really wonderful way for engaging the farmers, providing the plan for change, and then looking at tracking that throughout. We're then looking at how we can, as we build the project, add increased sophistication around some of the monitoring, some of the water quality impacts, and so on. But that's a consideration that's still being ironed out. But yes, I'm trying to give you a flavour for. We're looking at least 4 different domains of outcome and impact, not just participating in a practice, but other things like, even it's really important to us, but social connection and cohesion and confidence that farmers have in the future, the cooperation of different groups, even things like soil carbon is something we're also looking into, and how we might be able to capture that, because that's another benefit that can flow from this work. So it's a big question, but I'm very keen to report back on how we're going with it, Ken.
Thank you, John.
Good to see you again.
John, we don't want to overstay our welcome. You and Tanea may have an important business day. Are we okay to continue for a little bit?
We're good, Dana. I'm probably about 10:30 our time, which must be 8:30. I've got another meeting which is 5 minutes down the hallway, so about another 10 or so minutes from but I'm on everyone else's time. Normally for at the Springside Inn, we'd get a round of drinks or something from Sean and kick back, but a bit early for that at the moment here. But anyway, please, yes, so long as you.
Other questions from our audience? Speak up, please.
This is Peter Rogers. I have a follow-up question on Rick Nelson's. John, you showed that one screen that had resistance to change, if you will. And you addressed the first one. What about the next 2 that were listed there?
Yeah, so we had there the positive reinforcement was the third one. I'm just trying to remember, Sarah, what was the second one?
Aversion to loss.
Yeah, the loss aversion. So, Peter, I guess you just want a bit more elaboration on those.
Yes, please.
Sure. So if you think about the loss aversion, it's a simple process that in some ways from a behavioural science point of view, but when we go to make any kind of change, we can lose something. I'll give an example from perhaps the cane industry here, which might illuminate this. So it's a psychological loss that can sometimes come from adopting something new. So there were potentially some farmers in an Australian setting, and we've observed in some instances similar things in Owasco, that were farming a certain way, might be a certain use of an implement or a decision to roll out a cover crop or not, or the way fertilizers applied. based on perhaps the way their father was doing it. A lot of farms, of course, are multi-generational. That's something we know about the Owasco watershed as well. And that's important for a number of reasons, as is the sense of, as a farmer, growing up and on the land, that you're an environmental steward. And that's part of your identity, for example. And it's been ingrained in you for a very long time. And so when there's the development, for example, Peter, of an environmental challenge, like the harmful algal bloom outbreak, and then associated with that, there's some evidence and data that links that back to a number of things, including agricultural runoff, which then in turn agitates in certain strands of the community a pressure to be applied on the farmers to change and to adopt something new. What's psychologically happening in that moment is there's a sense of, if you will, vilification or blame that's being put on someone, but that's not the key issue here. But by asking them to adopt a new practice or to change that rate of fertilizer or the way it's applied or whatever it might be, potentially losing something. And they're losing something about their sense of environmental stewardship. That is, it contravenes what we already understand us to have. So if I agree, Peter, that I'm a farmer and all of a sudden I've got to change, and that change might contradict what Dad's been telling us to do for 20 years, and it kind of contravenes in my mind the sense that I'm looking after the environment and always have been, then we're losing something there. And so there's an aversion to that, and it can be deeply set. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that's a commonly held thing. I'm not saying that's what is happening rampantly throughout the Owasco watershed, but there's a chance that there might be some people, and that we think that there are, that might think like that. And it's also not just the farmers. I keep going back to this, but there can be even scientists and others who have particular views or have done studies or various things that if shown to not be correct or if not endorsed, can potentially come at a loss of reputational esteem, funding for a particular project. There's a range of different factors, Peter, that we could dig into there, but it's quite significant. And the lack of positive reinforcement is, it's just thinking about all the efforts to date to encourage change, if you will, or adoption of farming practices, and we're talking about the agricultural sector specifically, that promote better water quality, have tended to have more of a focus on punishment, might be the best word to describe it, but the focus in some ways, whether it's from a legislative point of view, whether it's an inspection program point of view, whether it's another kind of, even a communication point of view, just generally speaking, what I've noticed is actually a shift, frankly, well, it's now almost 18 months, Peter, we've been involved. And I'd actually like to even call out Adam here for being very open to this and looking at driving it, but having a more inclusive and positive approach, as in looking at how everybody needs to get involved, not just the farmers, and thinking about the positive messages that can be portrayed out of all of this, I think is a really good move. And a great step in the right direction. So that's really what we're also talking about, but a lack of what's in it for the farmer in a kind of psychological, reputational sense by adopting something different. We're trying to get at that.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much, John and Tanea. Fascinating presentation. I think I've listened to versions of this 3 times or so, and each time I'm perhaps gaining additional understanding. I look forward to, I think we look forward to working more closely with you as OWLA and also as the Management Council, working more closely with your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you, everybody. It's really a privilege to be asked to come along here, and we're looking forward to checking back in with you, keeping updated on our progress, and more than anything, if it's okay, we'll come back to you with some ideas about when we can roll out this training program and see if you're interested and provide some dates and take it from there.
Good, good, good. I think we would very much appreciate that.
Beautiful. Well,
Wonderful.
enjoy.
All right then.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll let you get on with your day and we'll get on with our evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye
Thank
now.
you.